Hello and welcome to the respiratory system with M.Hook. We'll look at the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. So first let's do broad functions. Major function, respiration. The whole point of breathing in oxygen, getting it to our cells, is for cellular respiration. That's the process that occurs at our mitochondria, where we break down sugar, use oxygen, and we make ATP, energy. Other byproducts, water, which is fine, and carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that we have to get rid of. If it builds up in our body, it's toxic. So all of the functions almost of the respiratory system are to get to this process, get the oxygen to our cells, get the carbon dioxide out. So you've probably already guessed, respiratory system is very linked to our cardiovascular system so that we can transport and get those gases in and out. Other functions of the respiratory system: olfaction, smell, speech, and then filtering, warming, humidifying the air before it gets into our lungs. Okay, these are very important processes of respiration. You need to know these really well. I'll go back through them several times. The different processes that occur is first pulmonary ventilation. That's getting air in and out. It's breathing. External respiration. Respiration in this case refers to diffusion. So this is diffusion of gases from the air in our lungs into the blood and back the other way. So when we breathe in, oxygen from the air we breathe in diffuses into the blood, whereas carbon dioxide diffuses out of our blood into that air. Next, transport. Transporting the gases through the blood. And we'll look at how the different properties of those gases changes how they are transported. And then we have internal respiration. So this is the diffusion between our blood and our body tissues. We've got oxygenated blood coming into the capillaries. It diffuses from the blood into our tissue. Carbon dioxide is made in the tissues, so it's higher concentrated there. It diffuses into our blood. And you could also add that fifth step, cellular respiration. At the mitochondria, our cells take sugars, break it down using oxygen to make energy, water, and carbon dioxide. So those processes, the first two, pulmonary ventilation and external respiration, are accomplished by the respiratory system. Transport and internal respiration accomplished by the circulatory system. So this should be a good review of what you learned there. Make sure you take some time to review and think about this slide, because we will come back to it time and time again. There's a nice interactive animation you can do on your PowerPoint as well. Okay, so now let's go through the anatomy. Then we'll hit physiology. So the major organs will hit your nose, your nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses. A lot more going on there anatomically than you would guess. Your pharynx, or your throat, your larynx, your voice box, your trachea, your windpipe, and then the branches off of there that form your lungs, and the ends of those branches, the alveoli. We'll look at it both in diagrams and in cadaver form. Okay. There are two functional anatomy categories. Most of your respiratory zone is going to fit into this zone, the conducting zone. That's basically just these passageways that air moves through. The functions there, it's going to get the air ready to get down into your lungs. It's going to clean the air and filter it. It's going to warm it up and humidify it before it gets to those alveoli. The respiratory zone, on the other hand, is the site of gas exchange. So this is that external respiration where we have gases diffusing. So that's the end of our bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. And you'll learn more about that as we go. So now I'd ask you to think about those different processes we looked at the last page, and what would the conducting zones help with? Pause to think about it. It would be pulmonary ventilation. The other structures that also help include our diaphragm and other respiratory muscles like your internal and external intercostals, the muscles between our ribs. Okay, we're going to start our anatomy at the nose. Lots of functions here. Basically, all the functions of your conducting system are going to be started in the nose. So first, you've got that airway for conduction, pulmonary ventilation. As soon as the air comes in, it's going to start getting filtered and cleaned. You've got the vibrissae, the hairs, you've got your mucosa there, and then it also moistens and warms. It also serves as a resonating chamber for speech, so think about if your nose is really stuffy, how your voice sounds different. And it has receptors for olfaction. Your olfactory receptors sit at the top of your nasal cavity, sending information up to your brain through the olfactory nerve. Okay, you've got two parts to your nose, the external nose that you can see, and the internal nasal cavity, that space there, which is really rather large. Externally, you've got the root, bridge, dorsum nasi, and the apex of your nose. At the apex of your nose, you've got your two nostrils or nares, which have your alae, this cartilage, wrapped around the outside. So there's a nice view of the external structures. And here you can see that hyaline cartilage as well as the dense fibrous connective tissue that make up your nostrils. Now let's move internally. The two sides of your nasal cavity are divided by your nasal septum. That goes along the midline sagittally. So if you think about if somebody has a deviated septum, that will go more towards the right or the left. It wouldn't be straight down the center. The back of your nasal cavity doesn't have any specific structure that divides it. There's no sort of flap or anything. But we call the back the posterior nasal apertures. So those are the openings from the nasal cavity down into the pharynx on each side of the septum. Think about a camera, an aperture is an opening. It's how much light's getting through. So there, it's how much of an opening you have to the pharynx into your throat. Bones. On the top, you've got the ethmoid. So that's where the olfactory receptors are going to be, with the olfactory bulb sitting on top, right below the rest of your brain. Then behind that, you've got your sphenoid. You can see a paranasal sinus there. On the bottom, you've got your hard palate and soft palate. And in the front, you'll have nasal bones, your conchae, and your vomer. Okay. So just moving into the nose, this opening space with hair is called the nasal vestibule. A vestibule is like a waiting area. That's where we wait, that's where we come in. And the vibrissae, or hairs, are the first place where we start filtering. They're going to catch any large, coarse particles in the air that we're breathing. And lining this whole space, you've got mucosa. The cells there are going to secrete mucin, which combines with water to make mucus. You'll also have different types of secretions occurring, like lysozymes and defensins as antimicrobials. And then on the roof of your nasal cavity, right where you've got your ethmoid bone, you're going to have the olfactory mucosa with olfactory epithelium. So that's where your olfactory receptors are. You've got lots of olfactory receptors. About 3% of your genome is dedicated to making different types of receptors. And whenever you breathe in, particles from the air are going to dissolve in the mucus and bind to epithelial receptors. And when those olfactory epithelial receptors get hit, they send information up through those little holes in the cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone to the olfactory bulb of your brain. And that goes into the rest of your brain. The other thing that you have on your mucosa is called cilia. So cilia are those hair-like structures that move in a wave-like fashion. So lining here is hairs. And they're going to keep pushing anything that gets caught in the mucus towards your pharynx so you can swallow it. When you swallow it, the mucus will go into your stomach and anything there will hopefully get broken down by the stomach acid. So it just keeps pushing, pushing, and pushing backwards. Okay. So vestibule with vibrissae, posterior nasal aperture, respiratory mucosa, olfactory mucosa. Here you can see a real person's sagittally cut down the middle. See one side of the nasal cavity. And what you can see here are these 3 folds. Those 3 folds are actually pieces of bone that come out and are surrounded by membrane. Those are your nasal conchae. You've got a superior, a middle, and an inferior. And those go out from the middle towards the side. There's your vestibule with vibrissae. There you can see your olfactory mucosa leading up into the brain that's been removed. So why would we have these conchae? They're great. You've got these big folds which increase surface area, so we have more mucosal area that we can catch anything on and filter it. And it also increases air turbulence. So you've got these meatuses, these little canals that air can fit through. So everything gets mixed up more and hits more of that membrane instead of going straight back. It gets pushed inside there. So here's a view from the front. This is a frontal section getting cut, and you can see the conchae and their curves. Yep. As soon as air comes in, it gets started on filtering, heated and moistened. We don't want it to go in dry and cold into our lungs. Next, going along with our nasal cavity is the paranasal sinuses. So those are spaces inside some of our bones that are lined with respiratory mucosa. Why would we want these spaces? You can see the frontal and sphenoid from the sagittal view. First, they lighten our skull. Bone is really hard. It's really heavy. So if we have spaces, we lighten the load that we have to carry with our necks. Next, because they have respiratory mucosa, they're going to be secreting mucus. They're going to also help air move through there, reverberate, get filtered, warmed, and moistened. Your only concern there is if you aren't allowing the mucus to move through, if it builds up there, you can get infected because the mucus, if it doesn't drain, it just becomes this lovely, warm, cozy area for bacteria. Okay, we're breathing in. The air's gone through our nasal cavity. It goes to the back, to the posterior nasal aperture, and it goes into your pharynx or throat. So this is a skeletal muscular tube that goes from the base of your skull to your 6th cervical vertebrae. And it goes past your nasal cavity, oral cavity, and down by your larynx. And there you have 2 options. Anything passing through this tube can go down into the larynx and to the trachea, into our respiratory system. Or if we swallow, it can go back into your esophagus, go down to the stomach. The pharynx regions are named for what they're by. So the 3 regions you can see color-coded here are the nasopharynx, by your nasal cavity, the oropharynx, by your oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, by your larynx, by your voice box. So the functions of the pharynx, we have both a passage for air and food. We're going to separate which goes which way. It provides another resonating chamber for speech sounds, and it houses the tonsils. So in your nasopharynx and your oropharynx, in different areas, you'll have your tonsils. There you can see your palatine tonsil, your lingual tonsil, your pharyngeal tonsil, and your tubal tonsil would be up here by the tube that goes into your middle ear. Purpose of tonsils, they're MALTs, mucosa-associated lymph tissue. There where we start our immune response, you'll have the B cells, T cells, looking for specific foreign antigens to mount an immune response to. Next, the larynx. So your larynx is this open space that air goes down into your respiratory system through. On the top, you've got what's called the epiglottis. And when you swallow, the epiglottis comes down and covers up this space. So food goes into its proper channel posteriorly into the esophagus. You also have your vocal cords or vocal folds in your larynx that give us our sound, our speech. Okay, so functions, it provides an open airway. Patent means open. We always want to keep this open so that air can always be moving in and out. The only time we cover it is when we swallow. Good. There are several cartilages in your larynx. They're all hyaline cartilage except the epiglottis. And the ones that we're going to focus on is your thyroid cartilage. Your thyroid cartilage is this portion right here where your thyroid would sit outside. And in the front it comes to a prominence called the laryngeal prominence. That's also called your Adam's apple. Above the larynx you can see the hyoid bone. Remember that attaches to the tongue and it's important for swallowing. Your epiglottis is actually elastic tissue. Think about it, it's elastic cartilage because it has to stretch. It has to move and bend down and cover up the glottis or space here when you swallow. So this is a nice side view showing how the epiglottis would come down and cover this space when we swallowed. Same idea here. Here's a cadaver version. There's the epiglottis. You could see it come down and cover this space. This is a view from the back, so your Adam's apple would be up there in the front portion of the thyroid cartilage. And there's the hyoid bone attached. Here's a view with more structures left. Epiglottis. Glottis comes down. You actually have two folds of ligaments in your vocal area, in your larynx. You've got your true vocal cords. Those are the white ones there. They're avascular, so they're shown as white. And then above that, you've got the vestibular folds, your false vocal cords. Vocal folds have lots of elastic fibers. They vibrate. And this space is the glottis. So the epiglottis comes down and covers the glottis. The vestibular folds help it seal in place whenever you swallow. And as you move air in and out, it causes your vocal folds to vibrate. And there you can see the vestibular folds helping to seal the glottis when the epiglottis comes down. So how do we make different sounds? Well, the pitch of your voice, of what sounds you're making, is determined by the length and tension of your vocal cords. So what I would do to show this in class is I would use a rubber band. And I would pull the rubber band really tight and have somebody make it go. And they would hear really high pitch. If I loosen them up, they'd do it again, it'd be a really low pitch. You can see this on a violin. The G string is the biggest. It's very thick. And when you play it, it's very low. The E string is really, really thin. And when you play it, it's really, really high. It vibrates really, really fast. And then how loud you are depends on how much air you force through. If you force a lot of air through, you're loud. If you force less air through, you're quiet. Going down from the larynx, that leads directly to the trachea, or your windpipe. And this shows, this is the front of your body, that's the back. This is a transverse section. You've got your trachea in front, and behind it your esophagus. They're actually connected together by adventia, this connective tissue here. Going down to the bottom of your trachea where it branches to your main bronchi. There's a little horn in here. That's called the carina. It's a little spur. Then we're going to see these branches until we get to the end of our lungs. Here's a nice view showing the C-shaped cartilages that make up our trachea. It's really important for this to stay open, so the cartilage helps it do that. It helps it stay patent. That's so that air comes in and out. We never want this to close. We always want air to be able to move. We don't want it to be able to collapse. And here's a microscopic view. Look at the lovely hyaline cartilage there. You've got your chondrocytes in the lacuna. You've got some submucosal glands. And then this pseudostratified columnar epithelium that has cilia. So they're column-shaped. It's really one layer, but it kind of looks like two. And the cilia there on your trachea are now moving in a wave-like fashion up, so that anything caught in your lungs goes up through the trachea, past the larynx, and gets swallowed. In the next video, we're going to start talking about the bronchi and their subdivisions.